Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in today's video, we're going to talk about how to make our own add-in for Fusion that will allow us to send our files directly to a 3D print utility. So we can see that I've added this button here, Send to Creality Print, and when I click it, it's going to take my entire component, which is all the bodies or subcomponents in the design, and it'll send it directly to Creality Print. Now, the main reason for doing this, I've talked about this in a previous video, is that the Save as Mesh dialog has changed. And now every time we want to send something to a 3D print utility, we have to use the drop down to select it. And then we need to make sure that it's going to the right place. So since 99.9% of the time, I send it directly to Creality Print, I don't save individual STLs, and I don't even touch any of the refinement settings. I'm going to just allow it to use all these default settings and send the file directly to Creality Print. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to walk through the process of figuring out how to do this. We'll look at a couple of API resources. We'll talk about finding a sample code that does work or does close to what you want. And then we'll talk about understanding the code that we're looking at and the object model, basically the structure of the programming interface in Fusion. And then we'll walk through step by step, taking a default or a standard template for an add-in and then building our own and testing it. So if you are new to API and have no experience with Python or with Fusion API, then this might be a little bit tough, but we're not going to be going super deep into all these topics, but we're just going to try to cover the basics of a user that's trying to figure out how to do this on their own. So the first thing that we need to do is I'm going to just have the Shark model open. You can go to the description and you can download this as well if you want to use it, but really any file will work. Note that what we're doing is we're taking the top level component, which means all of the bodies and all of the subcomponents in the design. If you want to dive a bit deeper into the code about how to actually identify individual bodies, then you can configure it for a selected body and so on. We're also going to talk a bit about how to get this on a specific toolbar and how to set up the icon for it and all that kind of stuff. So stay tuned. We're going to go ahead and get into that now. But first I need to go back into my add-ins and I need to stop the one that's running. So the first thing that we always need to do when we're thinking about API is take a look at the Fusion help file. And I'm going to put all these links in the description of the video. So I would suggest that you go there and that you open up each of these links as we talk about them. So the first link here is going to be just the basic Fusion API user manual. So if you're looking for introductory content, the basic concepts of Fusion API, it uses object-oriented programming or OOP, and this is pretty standard across the board for Python programming. So if you do any sort of YouTube or Google search for OOP programming, loads of resources will come up. We do obviously have this series that this is, this playlist that this is in. We have this series where we started from scratch talking about the basics of Python and moving into a couple of other topics. So you can always go back and watch those videos as well. So one of the important things is to understand the object model. Now the object model is how we're going to access different things inside of Fusion. So if we open up the object model, and we take a look at this big spreadsheet, or this big image, I've blown it up a little bit, but basically what we need to do is we need to understand that Fusion is the application, and we need to access the application. In the application itself, you can have things that are independent of a model that you have open. So things like application events, these are things like projects and folders in the data panel. The user interface is independent of, in a lot of cases, is independent of the model. But then when we get into actually having a document open, in our case, the whale shark, then that's where we need to start accessing different pieces of information. So we need to access a Fusion document. And in order to go a step further, we can access then the design. And then to go a step further, we access the export manager. And then now you can see all of these things are in a single level underneath the export manager. And if we go all the way down, we see that we've got STL export options. So in order to access this, we need to first tell the program that we need the application, the document, the design, the export manager, all the way down to this STL export option. So when we are thinking about creating a program, and if you're starting from scratch and you have no sort of knowledge on this, then I suggest you start looking for sample programs. And there are tons of them inside of the help file in both Python and C. So I've already found it for you. So you can go to the link and you could just go ahead and navigate there. But at the very bottom of the product documentation, there's a section called sample programs. And oftentimes when you find a specific object, because now we know STL export options is the thing that we're focusing on, you can search for that, you can find it, and then inside of there, when you scroll down, they'll also have any related sample programs. So we can see here that we've got export to other formats, and then we've also got this STL Export API sample. So we'll take a look at that in just a second. But what's important here is that we understand that this object that we're accessing, the STL Export Object, has a bunch of different properties in it. And if we look at those properties, there are going to be things like available print utilities. So this is going to be how we access a specific 3D print slicer. There's information about the file name, which we don't care about because using a 3D print utility, we're not actually saving externally. But what's important for you is to note that there are options for things like mesh refinement, or if you want to use things like surface deviation to determine the mesh density. These are all properties inside of this object. So if you are going to continue to develop this thing that we're working on here, then you may want to also open up your own dialog and offer some options, or you may want to default to the highest refinement level. And when you do that, what you do is you click on these options here, mesh refinement, and it'll give you a little bit of information about how to access that property. We can see that it's in the STL export options, and we're under Python right now. And then you access it by mesh refinement. And generally what I like to do is, again, I like to go and look at a sample program. So for me, there are two here. This first one, I will just save you a little bit of time. It's going to have way too many options in it. The second one is the one that we're going to look at. It's a little bit more straightforward. So I'm going to left click on it, and it's going to bring up the code. Generally, what I would suggest here is that you copy this code and you start a new script and test it out. We're going to walk through that process a little bit, but I want to just look through the code a little bit first. Now, whenever we talk about learning API or learning to create our own scripts or add-ins, this process is very cumbersome. What I mean by that is if you don't instantly know how to access all these different pieces of information, then it becomes a big chore to sort of understand it. So I'm going to try to go through each of these little bits of information to try to help better understand it. It would certainly help if you've got this PDF open on your own screen on a second monitor or something. We're going to hop back and forth between them, but it would certainly help you if you have that open to help you understand. So the first thing that happens inside of here is at the very top, it's going to access a couple of things. For example, Autodesk Core, Autodesk Fusion. So these are the basic imports that we need to be able to get all of the specific code to access these different pieces of information, these objects, these properties. And then once the code starts, it begins by getting the application. So if we hop back over to our PDF, we can see the very top bar that gives us access to everything else is the application. Then as we drill down a little bit further, it gets the user interface, which in our case we don't need, but if you wanted to do things like create a command, which is going to be, let's say we're going to create a message box to the user, then we would need to access the user interface. We will be using the command definition in a non-traditional sense. We don't actually need it, but I'm putting it in the code just in case we end up adding more downstream. If we add more later, like a dialog that pops up and asks the user if they want a fine refinement or medium or low refinement, that kind of thing. And then from there, it starts to access the specific design that you have open. So it's accessing the app active product, which is Fusion, this application, and then it's going to the design. So the design, again, as we start to drill down, we're now getting to here. Now that we're in the design, we can start accessing specific things that we need, like the export manager or the component, and then from the component, we could drill down to features, then we can drill down to sketches, and so on. So again, now that we've got the design, we access the root component, which is that very top level in our Fusion design. So remember I said that we're going to be taking everything with us, everything underneath that top level. Well, if you wanted to drill down further to other components or bodies, this is where you would need to begin to access deeper information. So instead of the root component, you would need to drill down a bit further. From here, we now access the export manager. The export manager belongs to the design, which the design comes from the product, and the product comes from the application. So once again, looking back at our object model, we got the application, we got the document, the design, the export manager. So now we're all the way down to being able to finally access the STL export options. From here, now we can get into accessing options for STL export. And so what it's doing here is it's creating this STL export options where we can start to configure things like whether or not we want a higher refinement level. We're not going to be using those options, but they're still sort of built into the code in this example. In some cases, you may need these options to access exporting to a print utility, for example. But this same STL root options, that's the same bit of information that's going to allow you to access those other features like the mesh refinement, those kinds of things. Then it's going to drill down a little bit more and get our STL options. And what it's doing is it's looking for available print utilities. So the reason that this is important is because if we go back into Fusion and I right click and I do a save as mesh and I say I want to use the print utility option, this drop down list starts with Cura in my case, and it has preform, and then I have my custom one, which is the Creality slicer I'm using. So at the top of that list, Cura is the first item inside of my application list. Preform is the second one. So if I wanted to send this directly to the Cura slicer, this one here, print util 1, is that first item in the list. Print util 2 would be the preform slicer, and so on. If you had a long list of slicers, you could just identify them by those preloaded utilities. What we're actually going to be doing is we're going to point it directly to a address on our computer for the executable file for a specific print slicer. In my case, the Creality print slicer. And part of this is because it doesn't show up in our list, and neither does the Orca slicer or the Prusa slicer or some of the others that I have installed. Not all of them will actually show up based on their install locations or whatever reason. So we want to know how to point it to a specific one. And then this option right here, Export Manager Execute, basically goes through all of the root options that we defined. So in this case, the options for export, and then it does it. It exports it, it opens up the print utility, and then the model will be there. Everything after this is extra. And what I mean by that is if we look at the code, basically what this is doing is it's exporting each component as an individual mesh file. So it's looking for individual files. It's going to save them in the directory wherever your script, in this case a script or an add-in, is saved. And then it's going to go ahead and it's going to execute those STL options, saving them as individual files. So if you've got a bunch of components or a bunch of bodies, then it'll start to save each of those out with the file name based on the script directory, the parent component name, and then the body name. So if you've named the bodies body 1, body 2, body 3, then you're going to have a folder full of these different bodies, and it's going to create that STL export. So for us, we don't need anything past here. So we don't actually have very much code to make this happen, which is great. I'm going to go back to the STL export options, but we are going to be using that code and making some changes. So I do suggest that you go to the STL Export API and have that open, so that way you can copy and paste the code over rather than having to manually type everything. And again, if you want more information about each of these objects, so for example, send a print utility, then we can drill down a little bit and it'll just give you a little blurb of information, and then it'll give you a sample. I find that the sample programs are much more helpful than looking at some of these object properties. However, some object properties will give you more information than others. Some will give you information about specific calls underneath them, while others will just give you a little sample bit of code. Okay. So that is the basic bit of information we need to make this work. The rest of this video, we need to dive into actually creating that code. And again, we're going to do some copying and pasting. So back in Fusion, we have a decision to make. first thing we have to decide is whether or not we're going to make this a script or if we're going to make it an add-in. So when we look at a script, and I'm going to edit the script, don't worry about trying to do anything just yet. But when we look at the script, a script in Fusion is going to run once when we call it. So basically, you're going to have to go into the utilities or configure it some way so that you've got the ability to run it. And it's going to run through, and everything that we talked about, getting the root component, getting the export manager, getting the STL options, and then exporting it based on a very specific location for, in my case, the Creative 3D, which is a Creality 3D executable file for my print slicer. And when I run this, if I go to my add-ins and I go to 3D print and I run, basically what it's going to do is it's going to run through. It's going to open Creality print based on the location, and it's going to put my 3D print model inside of here so now I can slice it. So that works perfectly fine. But what we want to do is we want to also understand how we can create an add-in. And the add-in is going to allow us to add a button, send a Creality print, and when we click the button, it's going to do the exact same thing. Now, the main difference here is that we can set up the add-in to start every time we begin Fusion. So that way, there's just going to be a button that's inside of our solid tools in our design workspace, and I can just click that button every time I need to send my entire design to the 3D print utility. And remember, the whole reason we're doing this is because the Save As Mesh dialog changed, which means that we've got a couple of extra steps that we need to go through for a relatively simple process. If you don't want to export your STLs locally and you don't want to use the manufacturer workspace as your 3D print tool, then really setting this up as a single click solution can be a nice way to do it. So now that we understand what we're doing and a little bit of nuance about the code, let's go ahead and do it and jump in. So I'm going to go back to my add-in and I'm going to stop it. Then what I want to do is create a new add-in. So when we create a new add-in, we need to determine whether or not we want a script, again, something that was going to run once, or we want an add-in, and we can determine whether or not we want this to run at startup. So clicking the run at startup is something that we can come back and change. We can edit that detail later. Then we need to save or determine which programming language. We're going to use Python in this case, and then we need to give it a name. So in this case, I'm just going to put 0, because I use the zeros to keep them at the top of my add-ins list so we don't have to slide through everything. And I'm going to call this send to 3DP. And I'm going to put utility on it. So you can add a description, author version, all that stuff if you want. I'm not going to worry about it in this case, and I'm going to create it. When you create a new add-in, we want to begin by editing this. And we're going to have to trust the author in this case, just based on the permissions I have on my computer. And when you start a new add-in, there is going to be some default code in there that does a few things for us already that helps us get started. I'm going to minimize this. I'm going to go to my add-ins, and I'm going to run this so you can see what happens. So when we run this, 3 things happen. A command dialog sample shows up here in my add-ins dropdown. The show my palette shows up, and the send to palette shows up. So when we click command dialog sample, a little command dialog pops up. We can enter some text, we can enter a value, and then a message box for the user pops up with that information. When we go to send to palette, again, enter some text. We'll say, okay, this doesn't pop up, but what this allows us to do is show a palette, which is basically an HTML event handler, and then the palette shows up, and then that information that we sent will allow us to pass information back and forth, things like date and time, entered text, parameters about our model, and so on. A lot of this we don't need for what we're doing. I just wanted to point out that it adds send to palette, show my palette, and command dialog sample. Now, oftentimes when I begin this process of, I'm going to go ahead and stop this. A lot of times when I begin this process of trying to create a new add-in or a new script, it's good to work in stages. You always want to be aware of what you're changing. Unless you have the experience to just go ahead and start coding, you want to make sure that you're aware of what's going on. So the first thing that we need to understand is we need to actually dissect what's happening and where it's happening in our code. If you go to the links I put, there are going to be some information about introduction to the Python add-in template. So this is a great resource to understand a bit more about the template itself. It tells you each little piece that happens, gives you information about modifying the add-in, where the library files are located, information about each of the different sections, what you do need to modify and what you don't. There's also something here that I put about the user interface, which we'll get into, and how we can drill down and figure out where we can add things like a button to a specific menu. So now that you know where those resources are, we're going to walk through where some of that information is. So as we get started, this .py file, this is the name of our add-in. And basically what this is doing is as it's running, it's starting the commands. So the first thing it says here is commands.start. So that's the first place that we want to look. This command section, if we expand it, we've got our command dialog, we've got our palette send, and we've got our palette show. Those are the three things that got added to our Fusion interface. There is also this init.py section, and inside of this, this init.py is basically initializing. It shows command dialog, palette show, and palette send. And then we've got this commands here showing all three of those things. So if we're going to be removing 2 out of 3 of those, because we don't need actually a dialog, but we don't need any of this stuff to pop up. The first thing that I'm going to do is get rid of palette show and palette send and get rid of this comma here. I'm also going to remove them from this from import option. And even though they're still here inside of our command section, just removing them from here, the init.py, will prevent them from running. So we're going to save it. This white dot means it's not saved, so Control S. I'll go back to Fusion, and I'll just run it again to make sure that it's working. So now we should only see command dialog sample pop up, and we shouldn't have to worry about the send to palette and the other information. So everything seems to be working fine. Let's go ahead and stop it, and let's hop back into VS Code. So anybody that's following along still that has any amount of programming experience, you're probably bored out of your mind, of course. But anybody that is just trying to learn this, hopefully this is helpful because it's a lot of information to digest. So now we understand this command section. The commands are what's getting started when the program starts. So again, commands.start, which goes to init.py. And when we go to here, now what we're doing is we're starting just the command dialog, which means this palette send, I can right click and delete, get rid of it. And palette.show, I can right click and delete and get rid of it. If you were to just remove those without cleaning that information out of here, you get all sorts of warnings the program wouldn't run. So you need to make sure you understand all the different pieces that are talking to each other. So now that we have basically cleaned up to only run the command dialog, if we expand this, we now have an init.py in here, which is it's empty because it's going to this entry. The resources folder contains the icons, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The default is a gear icon, but we're going to steal the 3D printer icon from the Fusion install and we'll replace that. But right now, let's get into the entry.py because this is where everything is now happening. So a few things that we do want to point out. So the first thing at the very top, just like our sample program that we looked at, it's importing Autodesk.core. It's getting this section called Fusion Add-in Utilities, and it's importing config. Some of this stuff is extra that we don't need, but we're going to leave it just because it's good practice to have it here because honestly, a button that just exports to a 3D print utility doesn't have a whole lot of extra functionality. So if you decide to come back and start messing with this and adding more, it's good to have a little bit of these extra things still being imported. The next thing that we see is this app, which is getting the application, and the user interface. Those are two pieces of the puzzle that we want from our sample program. As we scroll down, there's some information about the identity of the command, so company name and add-in name. It's actually pulling this data from somewhere else. We're not going to worry about filling this in, but we do want to change the name, which is going to be what's displayed on the icon, and then the description, which is going to be our tooltip. So I'm just going to call this send to Creality Print because mine's going to be very specific for that. And then this is going to be a Fusion add-in that sends top level component to Creality print. So now we have the little information about the button. Is promoted here. This is basically saying, okay, now that we have information about the button, we're going to make it. We're going to put it on whatever panel you tell us. These to-do sections are in these sample codes, and it's basically giving us a little bit of a pointer to say, hey, there's some more stuff that you need to do here. Because right now, the button is getting added to the solid environment. If you've been using Fusion for long enough, you'll remember that it used to be the solid, the patch, and the sculpt workspace and things like that. So when that went away and we now have the design workspace where we have tabs for things like our solid tools and our surface tools and our freeform and mesh and all that, the backend code still says solid environment. So it may be a little bit hard to just know what these are, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But right now it's adding it to the solid environment, to the scripts add-ins panel, and the command beside ID, this scripts manager command, this is basically where it's putting the new button next to. So this information comes from an XML file. And one of the links that I put in the description of this video is basically a code, basically sample code that you run, which will spit out this XML file, and it'll tell you all the different commands and panels and information. So go in there and basically copy the sample code and run it, and it'll build out this XML file for you. Now, the XML file is a massive document, but basically what this allows us to do is it allows us to see things like the solid tab, solid create panel, new component, new sketch, create form, derive, and so on. So basically, as you scroll down through here, you can see here's automate, here's modify, and then under modify, we've got press pull, edit face, and then you can see there's a separator added. So if you go into Fusion, and we're on the solid tools, modify, press pull, separator, fillet, chamfer, separator, shell, and so on. Basically what it's doing is it's giving you all of those different pieces of information on all the commands. So this will give you enough information to figure out where you need to put your thing. So we're going to be putting it on the solid panel. So if we come back up to the top, we have our solid creation panel, which is going to be our Fusion solid environment. So this right now here is the T-spline environment. So you would want to scroll down and find the Fusion solid environment. But here's a little tip for you. Most of the tools that we're going to be dealing with are going to be the same. So for example, inspect, insert, select, these panels are common across the board. So once you find which panel you want to put it on, then if you want to put it next to another tool, then we would just simply pick that tool. But what we're going to do is we're actually going to leave some of that information empty. So we have our Fusion solid environment, which is the correct place, but we don't want to put it on the scripts add-ins panel. Where we're actually going to be putting this is on the insert panel. And then for the command that we want it to be beside, if we leave this blank, it's going to put it at the end, and that'll automatically put it on the top of our toolbar for us. So we can remove it if we want to. I'm going to go ahead and save this, so Control S to get rid of that white dot there. And we're going to come back and we're going to look at this a bit more, but let's just check to see if this is working. So utilities, scripts and add-ins, and then we'll run this. So what we should see is that we're now getting an icon called Send to Creality Print. It shouldn't do the right thing now. If we click on it, we're going to still get this dialog over here because we haven't fixed the code yet. But that's on the insert panel in our solid environment. Now, if you go to surfaces, you can see it's here as well because, again, that toolbar is common across the board. Insert, you can see that it's here. Sheet metal, insert, still there. And you can see that it's placed on the top level of everything. So it's not in the utilities because we don't have insert here. And if we go to manage, it's not there. But any toolbar that we have insert, it should show up automatically. And again, it's not doing the right thing yet because we haven't added the code, but at least we know that we've added it to the right place. So it's a great start. I'm going to go ahead and stop it again and go back to my code. Okay, so now that we know how to put the command in the right place, we need to also get it doing the right thing. So currently what it's doing is it's creating a new command, and there are a couple of bits of information that happen. when you're looking through the sample add-in or sample scripts, the comments are going to help you understand what's going on. So first here, it's creating a command definition. You can see it's got this add button definition. And then it's adding a handler for the command created. And then it's information about the workspace, the panel, the control panel, the controllers promoted, and so on. Now, if you'll notice that it's accessing workspace ID. So this is all the information that's putting the new bit of the new thing that we're creating, that button, it's putting that into the UI for us. So we don't want to touch anything in here for def start. As we go down here to def stop, this is what happens when we're stopping this. If we're going to stop the script, then we want to make sure that we remove that from the UI. So again, that's a section we're going to leave because it's deleting the command from the UI for us when we stop the script. If we didn't have that, then it would be just kind of stuck there, and we don't want that. So make sure that you leave the start and the stop alone, because those commands are going to be the button that we're adding. From here, as we scroll down, we've got a couple things going on. Command created, and if we keep scrolling down, I'm going to just keep rolling down. We've got command execute, command preview, inputs changed, validate input, command destroy. So what's going on in all of these? Because the thing that we left behind in this program is basically a little dialog box. So what it's doing is it's creating the dialog box, it's adding some arguments for the inputs, and then it's creating a text box, again, to enter some text. It's creating an input box for value, and then it's deciding what to do with those. So when we have things like input changed, preview, validate inputs, and so on, these things are happening in real time if we are, for example, typing some text into the text box. It's going to execute the preview, which is going to put the text on the screen, and then it's going to validate those inputs. And if we go ahead and we run this script again, or run this add-in again, and we go back to our insert command, so enter some text. So if I just start to type in new text, every time I add something new here, it needs to validate it. If I start to type in text here, it's looking at the argument to see, okay, well, it's looking for a numerical value. And some things in text are okay, like if I type in 1 IN for inch, it's fine with that. But if I just type in IN for inch without a value, it needs to know if I'm trying to type in a word, which is not a valid input, or if I'm trying to type in a numerical value with a text input that's going to be the units, for example. So everything that is happening in the program is leading up to figuring out if the inputs change, figuring out if the inputs are valid, and then the destroy part is if we hit cancel on the command. Basically, it's not saving any of that information, it's just dumping everything. So what happens here when we execute the command is basically it's looking for all of those different inputs. And then the preview and the input change and all that stuff, we don't need any of that stuff anymore, because basically all we need to do is we need it to send something to a 3D print utility. We don't even need the user input or anything like that. But the reason I wanted to talk about this is because if you do want to get user input, for example, if you want to know the refinement level, or if you want to manually enter a value, then you'd be able to do it with the information that's here. So for the most part, for us, all we need to do is we need to have a section for when the command is created. All right, so we've got this def command created, and we're going to keep this futil.log, and basically this is a Fusion utility, and it's an event handler. We want to make sure that we understand and we capture that, but everything else after that, we're just going to select and delete. So right now, nothing is going to happen when we create this new command. Basically, it's creating a command, but there's nothing that's displayed for the user. There's nothing it's capturing in the back end. So now we need to add the code from our sample that's going to capture everything that we need. So I'm going to hop back over to my STL Export example. So we're going to go to the STL Export API sample, make sure that we're on Python. And basically everything from try, we've already got the app equals Autodesk Core, and we've already got the UI app interface, but we want to make sure that we get everything else with the exception of this execute. We're not quite ready for that execute yet. So what we want to do is we want to copy everything from here all the way up to this get active design. So copy that, go back over to your code, and we're going to place most of this at the top. So I'm going to put it up here. I'm going to put a little space and then paste it. So the reason that we're putting it here at the top is because we are getting the active product, we're getting the root component, we're getting the export manager, all the STL options, and basically the only thing that we don't need to do is this export manager. So if like me, you grabbed a little bit of extra stuff, just go ahead and delete it. This line we are going to cut, and we're going to place down here inside of our command created. You will need to make sure that the spacing is okay. Python is kind of picky about that. But basically what happens is everything that we needed to capture, I'm going to go ahead and scroll back up to the top. Everything we needed to capture is happening at the top. I'm going to do Shift Tab and bring that stuff over to the left. So we're getting the active product, we're getting the design, we're getting the root component, we're accessing the export manager, all of our STL export options, the available print utilities, and then currently it's using print utility 1. So remember, if we run this now, it's going to go to the Cura slicer for me. But let's go ahead and save it and let's test it out. So back in Fusion, I'm going to go back to my utilities. I'm going to turn on, it looks like it's currently running, so let's go ahead and stop it and let's run it again. And if I click this, it's got the little sort of hourglass icon next to the cursor, and now it's opening the Ultimaker Cura slicer. Now remember, that was the print utility 1 inside of my print utility menu. So because I didn't change anything, that's exactly where it's going for me. It doesn't know what other slicer to use. This should still work, so we're just going to let it load. And we should put the model right in the middle. And it works. So if you're using the Cura slicer and that shows up in your list, you can do that. Remember, if you're using Save as Mesh and you have whatever print utility is that first in the list, that's the one that's going to open. For us, however, I don't want to use that. I want to point it directly to my Creality slicer. So where this says print utility 1, I'm going to delete that. And then I need to put in the location of my print utility. So in the case of the Creality slicer, this is going to be in my program files and Creality print. I'm using version 4.3. And then it's called creative3d.exe. And essentially what we're doing, instead of giving it the generic print util 1 or print util 2, we're telling it exactly where that print utility executable is, so it can open that before it pushes the STL to it. So let's save that. Let's go ahead and we're going to have to stop and restart it. A lot of people do like to run these from Visual Code, which you can do. You can run it in debug mode as well. But for me, I generally stop and start them, just kind of the process that I've become accustomed to. So yeah, we can see here now it's opening Creality print, and it's opening the model for me in Creality print, just like I would have expected. So it seems to be working fine. The last thing that we would need to think about or do is understand how to deal with the icon. Icons are going to be a little bit tricky because you need to either make your own or you need to find one that already exists in Fusion. So I did, again, include the link for the icons. So there's information about what is needed, 16 by 16, 32 by 32, and there is generally is a third one. There's a 64 by 64, I think. So those are going to be in the resources folder. And the resources folder is actually a local location. So you need to find where your API is saved. You can do that from Fusion. So if we go to our utilities, find the one that you're looking for, the details down here will tell you where the path is. So most of the time this stuff is saved in app data, which that folder may be hidden by default on your system. If you're on a Mac, then it'll be in a different location, obviously. But basically what you need to do is you need to go to that folder location. And then in that folder location, you need to put some icons. Uh, I will say that finding the icons from Autodesk themselves is kind of tough. So if you are trying to use, for example, the 3D print one that is the default one in the utilities section, then that's going to be in your local web deploy production section. And my suggestion to you is to just search for 3D print. So the word 3, the letter D, and print, and just search for that folder. It'll be much easier than trying to navigate through all these, because this right here, this is going to be the install ID, which changes every time you update Fusion. But what I do is I take the 64 by 64, the 32 by 32, and the 16 by 16, and I'll just copy those. And then I'm going to go into my location for my add-ins. We'll pull this over. So here's the new add-in, 0 send to 3D print utility. We're going to go into commands, command dialog, resources, and you can see here are the 3 that are in there. Those are the default gear icons. So I'm going to delete those and I'm going to paste these new ones in. So when you do that, you will want to make sure that you stop your utility. And I've actually found that I need to restart Fusion and close out VS Code to make sure that everything's saved properly. So I'm going to go ahead and close that out. And I'll try to run it here to see if it works. But again, I found that I really need to restart to make this work. So you can see it's cached the gear icon. So what we're going to do is we're going to stop this. And we're going to click run at startup. And I'm going to go ahead and restart Fusion. So I know with the last update of Fusion, they were really proud about this black background for the startup splash screen. The only problem is as soon as that's over, you get just a plain white screen. So the reasoning about having it load up if you're working in the dark, it doesn't really hold any water for me because it instantly goes to that white screen. I know a lot of users want sort of a dark mode, but until they have a dark mode, I don't think the dark splash screen really does anything for us. All right, so I'm going to open back up the same export settings and make sure I'm in the design workspace. And we can see that it's not on here. So let's go back to utilities. And it looks like it's not running. It says run at startup, but let's go ahead and run it. And we can see now we've got send to 3D print or send to Creality print. So we do have the correct button here. I click it. It should open Creality print. It should send the model directly to it. And that was kind of a roundabout way to get around using the right-click Save as Mesh option. But now I've got a single-click option that allows me to send it directly to Creality print without having to go to first a right-click menu, then going to toggle to print utility, and then hitting OK. Now, if I need to refine the settings, then I will go back in and I will manually do that, or I will reconfigure the send to Creality print option and make sure that I add those options, or I just kick it to a high resolution automatically. But I think that overall the process of this it's not too bad. I know we took quite a bit of time to do it, but hopefully at the end of this, you are able to generate your own code and you are able to work through a problem like this. So just as a quick sort of circle back, when there's a situation where we need to use an API like a script or an add-in to be able to solve a problem, whether it's creating a feature in a design, a custom tool, like a specific hole pattern that you always need to create, building those things out as an add-in using that sort of default sort of sample add-in is a really quick way to add extra functionality to Fusion. Now, this is a simple example of exporting an STL to Creality print, but it holds true for other concepts as well. So we were mainly looking at using the STL export. You could very easily add additional export options to this. So for example, at the same time you're exporting an STL, you could also do a step export or an IGES or even a Fusion archive file, for example. You could dive deeper into the components and you could have it work on a selected body or a selected component rather than grabbing everything in a design. And again, you could add or pull specific information or have the user provide specific information that you need. So all this to say that hopefully this was helpful in understanding a little bit more about the API. And at the end of this, you have a sample program that you can make a script or you can make an add-in, and hopefully you understand the steps that we did to achieve that. Now, if you have any questions on this, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.